What an honor, what a privilege, what a blessing for me to be here. I want to thank my dear sister Roseanne for those very kind and generous words. I want to salute the Foreign Affairs Symposium for being kind enough to bring me from wintry New Jersey and Washington, D.C. this morning. We had a wonderful salute to John Coltrane, and now in Billie Holiday's city, Baltimore City, in this grand institution, Johns Hopkins University. I want to first acknowledge the fact that in so many ways I'm here because of my dear brother Jack Leyland. Where is Brother Jack? Where is Brother Jack? Stand up, Brother Jack. Stand up wherever you are. Where are you? Where are you? He's in the back there. There he is. Yeah, give our dear brother a hand. Give our dear brother a hand. Give our dear brother a hand. He's straight out of Princeton. His beloved sister, Catherine, is one of the good friends of my blessed daughter, Zaytun, who's sitting on the front row. So just give both Zaytun and Catherine a hand, too. Is that all right? I appreciate that. That was the connection. And say hello to your beloved mother, Laura, and father, Robin, as well. And I think, one of the finest political theorists that I know in the country. His name was Michael Henchard, Professor Michael Henchard. Is that yes, it is. It's so good to see you. Love you, respect you, though, man. And of course, I salute the captain of the ship, Ronald Daniels, as well as Provost Robert Lieberman. And I was told that my dear sister Catherine Newman has come to Hopkins, and she is been here for a number of years. I have tremendous respect for her. And I don't know whether she's here or not, but if not, just send my deep love and respect for her. She's done a magnificent job on poverty. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. You can see I am in no rush whatsoever. We're going to drive back to New Jersey tonight, but I've got my Luther Vandross on my radio, so I'm ready. I'd like to begin with an epigraph from the greatest public intellectual 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois. 89 years old. He decided to put pen to paper, a trilogy, 3 novels. He'd been wrestling with global dissonance and global disorder for over 60 years. Can you imagine being 89 years old and deciding to write 3 novels? That's the quality of his commitment and conviction. He had recently emerged from a U.S. court where it put him in handcuffs because he was fighting to eliminate nuclear weapons and eradicate poverty and to render accountable global corporations after World War II, after the end of the age of Europe, with Europe a devastated continent and the emergence of 2 empires. Soviet Empire on the one hand, leaning toward more repression and regimentation, but also representing some hope, some alternative to the American empire, which, given all of its deep self-understanding, liberty, opportunity, and possibility, was still wrestling with structures of domination, not just Jim and Jane Crow, not just terrorizing, traumatizing, and stigmatizing black people, but losing sight, oftentimes, of the humanity of precious red. Brothers and sisters, they don't have to be in the room for us to be hypersensitive about their suffering, or working people of all colors. Du Bois had written a book called Color and Democracy, a critique of the United Nations. Oh, this is going to be the major agent for global governance? Who's on the Security Council? Who are the permanent members? Are you going to fight for decolonization? In Asia, are you going to fight for decolonization? In Africa, Du Bois says, I've got some Socratic questions to raise about confronting global dissonance, disorder, or anarchy in the Hobbesian sense of a war of all against all. Can you hear me all right? Oh, you missed all that? I'll start over again. Brother Michael Hampton, I love you so very much. I appreciate that, Brother McKim. Just step back a little bit. I like to be on intimate terms with technology, you know that. But you let me know if you can hear me in the back. It's very important that I communicate. The epigraph goes as follows, page 275 of the novel, The Ordeal of Man's Art. He says, I've been wrestling with these questions for 89 years. There are 4 queries. The first is, how does integrity face oppression? How does integrity face oppression? Second, how does honesty face deception? Third, what does decency do in the face of insult? And last but not least, how does virtue face brute force? In those 4 fundamental queries, integrity, not cupidity, love of money, not venality, willingness to sell your soul for a mess of pottage, but integrity, a sense of a self and a soul, making a trek from womb to tomb with moral consistency, or what Jane Austen once called constancy. You see. Honesty, intellectual honesty, trying to the best of our fallible ability to tell the truth, no matter what the cost, beginning with ourselves. No name calling or finger pointing, beginning with ourselves. And third is decency. This is a theme, of course, you find throughout the tradition that fundamentally produced me, going back to Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. James Baldwin says, all of my life, all I want to be is an honest person, an honest man. It takes courage to do it. And then last, virtue in the face of brute force, and that brute force is what I want to accent, because you can't talk about global dissonance without talking about terror, not just war. Yes, we need Clausewitz. Yes, it helps to read Machiavelli. Yes, it helps to read the realists, the Niebers, the Morgenthals. But we're talking also about the bureaucratization of terror. And for black people in America, given that it was American laws and American citizens who are often terrorizing black folk, when you look at the world, the globe, you're seeing the democratization of terror in the hands of everyday people who are targeting others, religious grounds, ethnic grounds, gender grounds, sexual orientational grounds. It could be anti-Arab, it can be anti-Jewish, it could be anti-Muslim, anti-woman, it could be anti-left or anti-right, you see. Which means what? Which means that when we talk about realism and idealism, and I love the subtitle, the balance of realism and idealism. That for me is a sign of insight and wisdom. Because there is no realism that doesn't presuppose in some sense some values, some ideals. And there is no idealism that doesn't presuppose some analysis of power and the need for security and safety. So the question is going to be, in so many ways, how do we tease out the truth in particular kinds of idealism, the truth in particular kinds of realism, and what choices will we make in confronting the massive social misery in the world in which we live, building on the best of the voices of the past. So I want to begin with Du Bois's first question. How does integrity face oppression? Well, for me, it takes me back to line 38A of Plato's Apology. The unexamined life is not worth living. It means the examined life is painful. We have to talk about courage, to think critically for yourself. And I'm speaking especially to young brothers and sisters of all colors. here at Johns Hopkins and other places. Because you live in a society so market-driven, obsessed with being smart and gaining access to dollars, that we're losing access to a tradition that focuses on wisdom, not smartness, and dollars to use in order to generate richer notions of public life and public goods. Let the phones be smart. You be wise. You be wise. You have courage. You have compassion. And I'm not promoting stupidity, but I'm saying that the paradigm's too narrow. And what Du Bois is talking about is the echo of what Socrates was putting forward in the writing of Plato. What does it really mean to be human? The unexamined life is not a life for the human. Our English word human derives from the Latin humando, which means bearing and burial. That's why we got to defend our humanities departments in professional managerial spaces like universities, obsessed with smartness and dollars, science, market, and technology. How do we ensure that humanities, having to do with the study of those particular organisms on the way to death, not perishing but dying? What does it mean to be featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces? Ourselves. You can't talk about the globe unless you begin with yourself, the local. What kind of creature, organism are you going to choose to be in your attempt to be a force for good that allows you to move from your roots, R-O-O-T-S, to the R-O-U-T-E-S, that will take you to every corner of the globe? There's a dialectical interplay between the quality of your critical engagement with your roots and the kind of routes that you take, that you preserve some sense of integrity. And these days, where everybody's for sale and everything is for sale, just to attempt to hold on to your integrity will make you look like a subversive, a revolutionary, a radical nonconformist, cutting so radically against the grain, people will raise the question, are you in touch with reality at all? Money-driven culture coming at you day in and day out. Du Bois says, no, I come from a tradition that says, in the face of being terrorized, traumatized, and stigmatized, I want to in some way embody and enact something called integrity, even as I tell the truth about what is coming at me. Be it white supremacy, being told you're less beautiful, less moral, less intelligent, be it male supremacy, be it imperial perceptions, as if an American baby has more value than a baby in Somalia or Yemen or Pakistan, so that the moral outrage that we have when a baby's life is curtailed in America somehow takes a premium over the moral outrage we ought to have when a baby is killed by a U.S. drone in Yemen or Somalia or Pakistan. It's true. Oh, Brother West, that sounds anti-American. No, that's trying to preserve integrity and be anti-injustice in America as it relates to foreign policy. Let's see what the facts are. Let's debate. Let's have a public dialogue about it. Let's have an uninhibited critical exchange. 223 babies, dead. 3,500, dead. Well, let's see. Oh, you get your data from NYU and Stanford. We get ours from the White House. Oh, okay. We get ours from Heritage Foundation. Okay. Nobody has a monopoly on truth. Somebody's right and wrong about this thing. Let's get to the bottom of it. Let's do away with the secrecy. That's just one small example of the kinds of questions that flow, Socratic questions that flow, as we take on this overwhelming subject, global disorder and dissonance and anarchy. Because let's face it, I think in the end, we all recognize that there are magnificent, wonderful things about being human, but Walter Benjamin is right in the 9th thesis of his thesis on philosophy of history, that history has been, over and over again, very much a kind of catastrophe, a pilage of wreckage upon wreckage of poor people and working people's bodies, lives lost, often rendered invisible. And that angel of history that's trying to somehow resist and respond to the cycle of catastrophe, of domination and exploitation and hatred and revenge. It's difficult to sustain, losing its wings, trying to put its foot on the brake before we go off the cliff with the ultimate catastrophe, which is ecological catastrophe. We're getting closer day by day. It raises the questions of a Jonathan Swift, not just a savage satirist, in some ways a misanthropist too. He said, I question whether the human species possesses the intellectual, moral, and spiritual resources to be able to sustain itself on the planet. The evidence might be that we're more likely to blow ourselves up than we are create some kind of better society. You say, oh, Brother West, that sounds cynical. No, I'm not a cynic. I'm a Christian. Christians are neither optimists nor pessimists nor cynics. They're prisoners of hope. But prisoners of hope over against thick layers of darkness. Against the backdrop of history, all the crimes and follies that Gibbon talked about in his great classic, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And that's the realism that has to go hand in hand with any kind of attempt to sustain hope, especially for those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. Each one precious. Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, chocolate side of Baltimore, poor side of Chicago, Los Angeles, Tel Aviv and West Bank, Ethiopia, Guatemala, India and Pakistan, across the board. And it's so easy to turn away, it's so easy to be in a state of denial. And yet when we have the occasion such as this, to say let's have some kind of reflection on this overwhelming subject matter, the last thing we want to do is to lock ourselves into one lens through which we look at the world or one school of thought. That's why when I talk about realism and realists and idealists, I say we can learn from a variety of them. Noam Chomsky, one of my dear brothers, he's a realist to the core in one sense. He's also an anarchist. Not an anarchist in the Hobbesian sense, but the anarchist in the wise sense. He is rightly suspicious of concentrations of power, be it in the private sectors of big banks and big corporations, obsessed with profit making, or be it big government that can generate what we're debating right now and what you all are rightly debating in a few weeks, like the institutions like the National Security Agency and the Orwellian project on steroids that keeps track day in and day out, not just of everybody, but especially those who, many of whom are trying to tell the truth. You see, there's no accident that they kept track of Martin Luther King Jr. every day of his life from January 1956 until the day he died, April 4th, 1968. We just discovered that his photographer, who took over 10,000 pictures of him, FBI informant, making phone calls every day. Every day. That's part of the surveillance. The most dangerous man in America, Martin Luther King Jr. The most notorious liar, the FBI said, in America, Martin Luther King Jr. That's part of the suspicion of a big government when it comes to the repressive apparatus and when it comes to national security state and national surveillance. That's very different than the kind of social service programs of big government. Government has a number of different sites, different spheres that we have to distinguish between in talking about how, in fact, we attempt to balance realism and idealism. But for me, it's very important to always begin with forms of death, because I come from a tradition, black freedom struggle. The black freedom struggle that is fading these days off the scene, but I'm hoping it's going to bounce back strong in the younger generation. And the black freedom struggle always says that you begin with forms of death. In some ways it echoes Plato. Philosophy itself is a meditation on and preparation for death. To philosophize is to learn how to die, says Montaigne. Or he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery, says Seneca. And you can hear that in the language of a Frederick Douglass. I had to learn how to die wrestling with Edward Covey. And when I reached that point, I was freed. It was not just a physical death. It was a psychic death that I had to wrestle with. It was a spiritual death I had to wrestle with. I refused to be afraid. I refused to be intimidated. I refused to be coaxed into deference to the very powers that were promoting my social death. Of course, he was a slave. Slavery was a form of U.S. social death. Just like Jim and Jane Crow was a civic death. Just like black people hating themselves and disrespecting themselves and believing they're not as beautiful or intelligent or moral is a form of psychic death. Or a spiritual death of just giving up and caving in and selling out for a mess of pottage. It's still just a living dead. And if you don't confront those forms of death, you'll never be able to talk about global dissonance and realism and idealism without any substance, because you'll never be able to stand up. You spend your whole life bent over, laughing when it ain't funny, and scratching when it don't itch. Wearing the mask, as the great Paul Lawrence Dunbar said. Brother Martin say anytime, every day, people straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere, because folk can't ride your back unless it's bent. How you gonna straighten up and take a stand? Way Sly Stone said, stand. There's a cross for you to bear. Things to go through if you're going anywhere. Stand. There's a midget standing tall and a giant beside him about to fall. We're talking about courage. University sites these days tend not to put a premium on courage, be it a discussion about the domestic or the global. Moral courage, intellectual courage, political courage. Why? Because it doesn't translate. Wu-Tang Clan says, cream. Cash rules everything around me. It doesn't translate to the Benjamins. It doesn't translate into wealth and status and position. Then it hardly counts at all. I mentioned before, I was just at Smithsonian today with a tribute to John Coltrane, and we had a fascinating discussion about why it was that Coltrane would continually go to the rallies of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., especially when Malcolm was talking about Africa. Not just because of his musical interest in Africa, but John Coltrane was an artist who straightened his back up, even with a European instrument. Played it like no European ever played it. But he knew cultural hybridity was real. It didn't scare him. And he was willing to tell the truth in his sound. I notice you used dissonance there in your title. And of course, dissonance is the blue note. It's the blue note. Duke Ellington says in his autobiography, "Music is my mistress." He says, black people have made dissonance a way of life. Made blue notes a way of life. The minor key a way of life. On intimate terms with forms of death. Veterans of terrorism in terms of being terrorized under slavery, American terrorism of Jim and Jane Crow and so forth. But at one's best, at black people's best, like Coltrane, the response was what? To be Socratic enough to say one is going to raise critical questions beginning with oneself, one's community, one's tradition, one's government, and other governments around the world. Which means you're going to be highly suspicious of any school of thought, any ideology, because they all have blind spots. You try to tease out their insights. You jazz like you're improvisational, you're flexible, you're fluid. You don't want to get caught being static and stationary, ossified and petrified. You keep on moving. And it cuts across ideological lines as well. I know you had Brother Bolton here a few weeks ago. That's quite a contrast, Brother Bolton and Brother West, though, isn't it? Well, this Johns Hopkins committed to a robust conversation. That's a beautiful thing. I fight for people's right to be wrong. Because I'm wrong sometimes. That's the libertarian dimension of being committed to the empowerment of the wretched of the earth, the poor peoples and working peoples. But like Du Bois, being very candid and honest about how one's vision is tied to a particular kind of analysis. And there's no doubt in my mind, that we're ruled these days not simply in this country by big banks and big corporations tied to politicians who themselves oftentimes need big money in order to reproduce themselves, and therefore more and more are unlikely to straighten their backs up and speak truths, but rather, like so many of our young people told over and over again, they want to be successful, which means they're willing to be well adjusted to injustice. Some of them can't wait to fit in. And it's colorful, cuts across color. Just want to be highly successful. Peacock-like, look at me, I'm highly successful. I'm on the stage. Say peacock strut because they can't fly. Old folk used to say. I come from a tradition talked about eagles. That's different. Talked about integrity and elegance and a dignity to keep track of what's going on the ground. So it's not obsessed with just folk breaking glass ceilings at the top, but begins with folk in the basement. I've been blessed to teach in prisons for 37 years. Can't wait Friday night to get back to Rawway with 150 brothers. We wrestling with Augustine's Confessions. Why? Because there's a courage there. Why? Because it's the underside. Why? Because it reflects the warped priorities of an empire that says that we're willing to invest almost $500 billion, a Marshall Plan in a carceral state, a penal state called the New Jim Crow, called the Prison Industrial Complex. But when it comes to one penny for new quality education for our young people, or jobs with a living wage, or quality health care without big pharmaceutical companies and big insurance companies in the driver's seat, we can hardly find a penny. That's precisely the kind of warped priorities that the great Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in the last chapter of his last book, Chaos or Community. It's called The World House. His particular response to confronting global dissonance, the world house. How does he fit into the realist and idealist? He doesn't fit at all. He's a blues man. He's a jazz man. He sees insights wherever he finds it and mobilizes it in relation to his vision. And his vision, like Coltrane, was what? A beloved community. Oh, but it's so soupy and so naive to talk about love. Talking about love in IR discourse, please grow up. That's childish. You can hear Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer and John Coltrane saying, the lens through which we look at the world, coming from a people so hated and despised, that love is liberating. It's emancipating. We begin by loving ourselves enough to straighten our backs up and allowing that love to spill over to form coalitions and alliances with other folk who are looking at the world through the lens of poor and working people, not necessarily or first and foremost looking at the world through the lens of stock markets or big banks or big corporations, not because those in big banks and big corporations are demonic or evil, rather because these are structural realities in place where people who find themselves in those institutions pursue the ends of those institutions. And yet you try to somehow convince them that they can use some of their own resources to promote what Martin, what Du Bois, what Fannie Lou Hamer, what Coltrane would affirm. How do you keep the focus on poor and working people here and around the world? What Chomsky's been concerned about for so very, very long and still going strong. How do you keep track of the three dominant tendencies on the globe? Financializing, privatizing, and militarizing. It's not just a neoliberal capitalist project, neoconservative. It's a kissing cousin. A kissing cousin. And if in fact we're unable to muster enough everyday people straightening their backs up, willing to pay a cost, trying to tell the truth, understanding the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, as Theodore Adorno pointed out, negative dialectics in those first few pages. And that vantage point becomes more and more contagious, especially among a younger generation hungry and thirsty for integrity, honesty, decency, and a sense of virtue in a world more and more saturated with commodification, marketization, commercialization, money, 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 me, material toys, material toys, material toys. He or she wins who has the most toys. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to put it so well when he said the major ecumenical movement on the globe is nihilism and cynicism. And the question is, how do you fight both? And by nihilism, he didn't mean Nietzschean forms of sophisticated conversation in tea parties or cafes, talking about how meaningless things are. He was talking about Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Might makes right. Those who have the money and the power determine what reality is, and in their corporate media representatives, they can narrow the discourse in such a way that any serious talk about truth as it relates to poor and working people is pushed to the margins or rendered thoroughly invisible unless you watch a little Amy Goodman. The Democracy Now! And a few others. And she's not alone. This is just not a U.S. phenomena. It's happening all around the world. All around the world. Heschel talked about nihilism and cynicism. He had in mind Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor in his last magnificent novel, Brothers Karamazov, where the failed believer and now a disbeliever wields power arbitrarily, which is the exact opposite of what any aspiring regime toward democracy is about. Democracy is the attempt to curtail the arbitrary use of power, especially as it relates to the weak and the vulnerable, especially as it relates to trying to ensure that there's a robust public life, public conversation, public education, public transportation across the board. And for the younger generation these days, oh, it's going to take quite a renaissance. Yes, it is. And it begins with each and every one of us having that courage to think for ourselves, to cut radically against the grain like the Emersonian self-reliant man. And that self-reliant man is not a self-made man like Henry Clay talked about it. No, it's nonconformist, like his disciple Henry David Thoreau. What can I do in my actions and words to awake my neighbors and fellow citizens from their sleepwalking? How do we somehow shake folk given the weapons of mass distraction that are coming at them every day and every night, 24/7? People wake up at different times. When they wake up, they don't necessarily reach the same conclusion. No, not at all. Our Tea Party brothers and sisters, they woke up. They said, oh my God, is Wall Street bailout arbitrary? Welfare. They've been talking about welfare all this time. It was Clinton who cut off welfare, and when poor people made bad choices and bad judgments, they were told, pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps. Oh, when the Wall Street elites make bad choices and bad judgments, are they told, pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps? No, here's $787 billion. Hope you pay it back. There's $85 billion every month for over 3 years from the Federal Reserve that will keep the bubble alive before that pops. Thank God we got this new book by Brother Thomas Piketty, the French economist, Capital in the 21st century. We were talking about that in the wonderful conversation we had with the young brothers and sisters at dinner. You see, even old Brother Paul Krugman, progressive liberal but not leftist. And I have nothing against progressive liberals, but I keep pushing them to the left. He celebrates the book. Capital, oh, that sounds like Marxism. Well, let's engage it. The forms of Marxism that are childish and subject to too much dogmatism, but there are subtle and flexible forms that talk about the tilt, not a tilt, an unbelievable move toward capital as opposed to labor, where labor hardly even matters. And there will be no confronting of global dissonance or global disorder or global anarchy without some kind of awakening of working people that moves not toward the Tea Party awakening, which is a right-wing populism that understandably critiques the elites but then ends up primarily obsessed, focusing on the weak and the vulnerable, rather than fundamentally confronting the most powerful. You see. But the awakening must in some way take place that leans toward accountability of elites across the board. And that includes persons like myself, Harvard, Princeton, on television. Got to have all the critical Socratic energy coming at oneself, because none of us have a monopoly. My dear brother, how you doing, man? I didn't see you there. Quite easy. Yeah, it's so good to see you, though. I'm talking the same thing I was 20 years ago when you were running NAACP, brother. Appreciate it. Good to see this, brother. Same challenge. The question is, do we in this country both fragile experiment in democracy and imperial adventure, that's what America is simultaneously, it echoes the great words of F. Scott Fitzgerald in his wonderful essay of 1938, The Crack Up. Test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. America is simultaneously a democratic experiment on indigenous people's land based on enslaved African labor and women in private households and working people wrestling with asymmetric relations of power at the workplace. But every generation, folks slowly straighten their backs up. But it's going to be difficult this time. Very, very difficult this time. One is because, as Martin pointed out in the World House in that last chapter, there is a chance that American empire is running out of spiritual gas. And what I mean by that is what Du Bois meant in chapter 1 of Souls of Black Folks, spiritual strivings, or why Aunt Esther dies in Gem of the Ocean in that 10-place cycle by the inimitable August Wilson. She was born in 1619, she died in 1985. Why is that so, August Wilson? Because I discern that America and Black America too no longer really want to straighten their backs up. They just want to become persons who fit into a system. They don't want to tell the truth anymore. They're less concerned about integrity. They're driven much more by cupidity. They're less concerned about decency. They don't mind celebrating politicians who tell lies and engage in war crimes as long as they appear telegenic on television or the same color they are. You say, well, wait a minute. Are you actually spitting in the face of Harriet Tubman and A. Philip Randolph and your grandmama and granddaddy, whose names others don't know, but you know they were persons of integrity and honesty and decency, but somehow you can now slide away just to gain access to your position and status. And the younger generation more and more have distant memories of it. Very distant memories of it. Talk about Martin Luther King Jr. Who was he? He had a dream. No. He's wrestling with a nightmare in the midst of that dream. Do we know that June 26, 1964, he called Malcolm X on the phone? Malcolm had left the nation on March 12th of 1964. They shook hands March the 26th in the Capitol right down the way. And when Malcolm said, I'm going to the United Nations because I'm going to put America on trial for the violation of human rights given its treatment of black people. And lo and behold, here's a call from Martin. I'm going with you, Malcolm. How many people even know that? What history would we had if they had come together? Oh, Malcolm, we know Malcolm. He was full of hate. No, he loved black people. He hated injustice. His love got hemorrhaged for black folk for a while, but it started spilling over as he continued to grow. Those are the kinds of memories that must become more vital and vibrant. One is because it's the truth. Last sermon Brother Martin was going to preach. Wrote it on a piece of paper in Memphis at the hotel. He said, tell my folk in Ebenezer I'm preaching a sermon on why America may go to hell. That's not Jeremiah Wright, that's Martin now. He didn't say America ought to go to hell, didn't say America should go to hell. He said America may go to hell if, in fact, America doesn't come to terms with the escalating oligarchy and plutocracy, if America thinks that somehow you can continually deal with the issue of poverty by escalating your prison industrial complex, never be enough police, never be enough prisons to deal with overwhelming despair of poor people. That's what Martin was talking about. And the fact that Martin was disapproved, 72% of all Americans disapproved of Martin when he died, talking about global dissidence. 55% of black people disapproved of Martin before he died. That's why you got a lot of older folk lying about how much they were close to Martin. Now that his body's in the grave and the culinary delight of terrestrial worms, you can talk about how close you were to him. I travel all around the country. Folk tell me upstate New York and other places, black folk were mobilizing against Martin. 150 people show up in an auditorium of 2,000. Some of them led by black preachers. Why? He's a communist. He's a communist. He's talking about Du Bois being a great man. Martin wasn't a communist. He's a Jesus-loving free black man. But he had some Socratic questions, and he had prophetic witness, and he was willing to pay a price by telling the truths as he understood it about America and the world, and he believed that precious babies in Vietnam had exactly the same value as precious babies in Birmingham or in Atlanta, and he was willing to act on it. Where does this leave us? You all been very patient. I don't know when I'll come back to Johns Hopkins. But I want to end on a blue note, because we cannot talk about the globe having the blues, the dissonance. Can't talk about America having the blues without talking about Socratic questioners and prophetic witnesses being blues people. Back to Coltrane. Listen to A Love Supreme tonight. You hear the spirituality of Socratic questioning of himself, of America, and the world, with influences from every corner of the globe in those 33 minutes and 2 seconds of musical genius. India, indigenous peoples, Africa is already deeply African because it's coming from an African people in the New World. Latin America. Coltrane, what you doing? I'm just a conduit of a people, of a tradition, of a community, of a struggle that's trying to somehow preserve integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue the way Du Bois talked about it. But I do it through my horn. But I'm a blues man, because if you're a blues man or a blues woman, you are a thinker of catastrophe. Ralph Waldo Ellison, Invisible Man, great novel. Reflects it. He says over and over again, blues ain't nothing but a personal chronicle of a catastrophe lyrically expressed. The king of the blues, B.B. King, says, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's the blues. That is catastrophic. Mind you of Sophocles' Antigone. Every cosmic force, every force in the universe is against you. Well, how did you respond? You straighten your back up, you preserve your integrity, your style, your sense of history, your subversive memory, your militant tenderness, your radical gentleness, your subversive sweetness, all integral parts of defining who you are. So as you think for yourself, learn how to love, empathize, sympathize, and enact and embody it, act on it, and be willing to pay a cost. Doesn't make you an idealist, but you certainly have ideals. Doesn't make you a realist, but you've got a real sense of the darkness that realists talk about in IR discourse. And in the end, you die. And you pass the tradition on to the next generation by your example. The great Immanuel Kant used to say, examples are the go-karts of judgment. So the folk who come after, who want to judge for themselves, say, here's an example of a person, of a group, of a community, even of a nation that tried to preserve its integrity, honesty, and decency, and a sense of virtue, that tried to be democratic to the best of its ability, tried to fight for freedom. Maybe they lost. Well, Samuel Beckett is right. Try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. And you pass on your fail better to the next generation. And if they're ready, they pick it up. And if they're indifferent, they turn their backs. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel is right again. Indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself. And if we're callous to catastrophe, if we're indifferent to the suffering of the weak and vulnerable, then we're not talking about global dissonance. We're not just talking about global disorder or anarchy. But in the end, we're talking about the end of the species. As Brother Martin used to say, nonviolence and non-existence. In this case, it's going to be non-existence or Socratic questioning, prophetic witness. and having the courage to hope. Thank you all so very much. We have good time for question and answer. Thank you for being so patient, though. Appreciate it.
Hello. All right, so now we're going to start our question and answer period. Again, we ask that you guys line up in each side of the aisle and that you limit your questions to 30 seconds so that we can have as many questions as possible.
Hello, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I think your message about U.S. drone warfare was very clear. I'm wondering if you have a message for the Johns Hopkins executive leadership about the billion-dollar partnership that Hopkins has promoting drone warfare and drone research on the Homewood campus.
Oh, no, appreciate it. No, you're teaching me, my dear brother. You're teaching me. No, but you want to engage in Socratic criticism in a serious way. Absolutely. But of course, Johns Hopkins is not alone in this regard. That universities, especially the modern research, of course, this is the first great modern research university of Daniel Coit-Gilman going back to 1876, imitating Humboldt's German university there. Over the last, since 1945, you've seen, as you know, a kind of convergence of government contracts, government money flowing into modern research universities. And so you just have to ensure that the Socratic voices, the dissonant voices, are heard both on campus as well as in the community in regard to any such activity that somehow ought to be not just scrutinized but called into question. Very much so. But I'm glad you mentioned that. But criticism does begin at home, and so I appreciate you. Because you based here too, though, right? Yeah, indeed. I admire your courage.
Thank you for the talk. I'll try to respect the 30 seconds, but a quick comment. It's so funny you talked about drone strikes and needing to think about attacks here at home, because the college debate topic was about executive war powers, and a group of black women from Baltimore made their whole debate argument about you can't understand that till you understand the way black bodies are targeted here. Black women from Baltimore City Public Schools, and they just were the first black woman to win the national debate championship just 2 days ago.
Oh, beautiful. On that issue, too?
Yes, on that argument.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And we're part of a group that's trying to bring this sort of debate to Morgan State University.
Oh, the great Morgan State. Absolutely.
Yes. So my question relates to that. I've taught your work to debaters in high school, and one of your concepts directly relates to this topic, the idea of prophetic pragmatism. I want you to explain it, but I have an example that elucidates my question. Brother Dhoruba bin Wahad, former Black Panther, talks about a debate he had with Ms. Sophia Elijah. Sophia Elijah said they should have a covert strategy to try to free political prisoners to avoid the backlash of the police unions. Brother Dhoruba bin Wahad countered and said it has to be public to create a public movement of awareness around the issue to hold people accountable. Ms. Sophia won, it was private, and the governor of New York was able to leave without anyone knowing about the pressure. Right? So, as a debater, I think you're going to say both for prophetic pragmatism. But I think Mr. bin Wahad is making an argument that I don't think he could use that term, given its baggage and its relationship to America. And that's not seen as pragmatic, taking that struggle to the community. But even when things like Ms. Sophia's strategy become successful, like with the liberation of Marshal Eddie Conway, without the public movement that's not seen as pragmatic, maybe even by Ms. Sophia Elijah, you don't have the public around Eddie. So I was hearing more about Boosie on my Facebook when he got free than when Eddie was free.
Yes.
Can you please discuss your idea of prophetic pragmatism in this context?
Oh, Lord, that's a whole lot on the table, my brother. And I appreciate
I'm a
that
debate
question.
coach.
And I love the spirit behind it, too. See, I don't think that one can make any inferences from an ism as it relates to a particular case. It's what the Greeks call phronesis, practical wisdom. You have to be able to analyze what the circumstances, what the conditions are, what the dynamics of power are. And it's not just about power and interest. It's also about integrity, ideals, principles, kind of person you want to be. So when it comes to covert versus overt, one, I'd want to listen to the arguments. I mean, Ben Wahad is my dear brother. As you know, he's in jail for 19 years as a Black Panther. He and I have worked closely together, been to Ghana together, worked on trying to put pressure on New York State with regard to the Attica laws, kind of things. And the BCP was working, continues to work in so many ways. So I had to listen to the arguments. But I do know in my own experience, though, we just had a wonderful gathering for Oscar Lopez Rivera, who's my dear Puerto Rican brother, who's one of the longest political prisoners in the United States. Mumia Abdul-Jamal, the whole host of political prisoners who I think we ought to cast a public spotlight on and welcome the arguments. We got people who disagree, and we can go at it back and forth. We need to have a public discussion about this. So I tend to think that the overt, so far in my own practice, but I can learn. I got to listen to the sister you talking about, who's talking about covert.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
What's good, Dr. West? My name's Hilario. I'm from the south side of Chicago.
South side of Chicago.
Just
right.
had a quick question. I wrote it down and keep it under 30 seconds. As a fellow Christian and future educator, how does one preserve his integrity within a system that is structured and cultured around an outdated conformity? And moreover, how does one integrate his integrity and straightening of his back into the youth that are protected by institutions holding them under dishonesty?
Boy, that's a beautiful question, my brother. Very much so. One thing is that as a teacher, because you have direct access to the precious little ones, that the sparkle in their eye, you know what I mean? The broadening of their soul, piquing of their imagination and intelligence, that in and of itself becomes a kind of wind at your back. So it might make it more difficult for an indifferent principal or a callous superintendent to somehow try to marginalize you, because you're there not to necessarily respond to the superintendent and the principal, but it's those precious young folk. Now, there would be circumstances under which you might not be able to do that any longer, but the good thing is, as opposed to other jobs where you don't have those sparkling eyes coming at you, hungry and thirsty for more, sense of perplexity, sense of curiosity, that you still may have to end up going to a different school. And because there's so many different schools around, and we know, I didn't get into, of course, the kind of privatizing of public schools taking place, the shutting down of so many schools, especially in poor chocolate cities in Philadelphia. I'm sure it's here in Baltimore, it's in Chicago. We fighting in Chicago, the teachers union under Sister Karen Lewis against Rahm Emanuel's administration. These kinds of issues have to be continually thrown out into the public, even as you engage in the everyday activity of touching those lives of those young folk. So that there's a sense in which I think you can answer your question so much better than I can, because you're in direct contact with the young ones all the time. But I do understand if you find yourself being pushed to the edge and you have to go to another school, but it's a calling. It's not a career. It's a deep calling that you have. It's a vocation. It's not just a profession. And that's something that young people need to see more and more. More and more. John Coltrane talked about a life task. He didn't talk about a job. It wasn't a gig. It was him working through his soul, trying to tell truth about the world in each site that he went. And that's part of what it is to aspire to be a jazz man, a jazz woman in the life of the mind that I've always tried to be in my own humble way. Thank you so much. Salute to them. Salute to them, brother. Definitely.
Dr. West, thank you very much for the talk. Very enlightening. I'm coming up from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies over in Washington, D.C. with a group over here. And a lot of us over there, we study international development. So we're coming from a position of power and wealth in the United States, and we're going to some very poor countries, working with some very poor, impoverished communities. And I was wondering what you thought our attitude should be as we go to those places to better serve those people and put those people first and really work for the communities and not for ourselves. What your thoughts are?
Well, no, I think you hit it on top of it. I think one is that, I mean, it's not just you all. I think this is true. What it means to grow up in an empire means that you carry with you certain elements of hubris and arrogance. And when I talked about Socratic energy, and what was distinctive about Socrates was that he had a humility. That's part of his intellectual integrity. He had a humility. He didn't know X, Y, or Z. He acknowledged he didn't know. He thought he knew more than anybody else besides because he knew nothing and others thought they knew what they didn't know. Well, that's the humility. What does that mean? That means, one, you're going to have to unlearn some things that you learned at Johns Hopkins. Oh, you got to do some, the learning and unlearning go hand in hand. It doesn't mean you unlearn everything, because you learned a whole lot of things at Hopkins. But you're going to have to unlearn some things, because Hopkins is a bubble. And you got to break out of the bubble. But you can get some good stuff out of that bubble. Good God, I've been in the Princeton, Harvard, Yale bubble for a long time. You know, and I like that bubble certain days of the week. Because I believe in intellectual joy, and I gave some of it there. But I know I got to unlearn some things. Go to the prison, go to our church. I discovered, oh, Lord, I've got to learn some things from my brothers and sisters, even though that's where I come from. Still need to learn. So learning, unlearning, learning, unlearning, not demonizing yourself, not demonizing others. When you go to these other places, they are human beings like you, which means what? They got their blind spots too. You're not romanticizing them. Stand in contact with their humanity. That's where the imagination, which is to say, will and empathy, get inside of their world, their shoes, walk a mile in their shoes. Get a sense of how they're looking at the world. Then you tell them, you're right here, you're wrong here. Tell me where I'm right here and wrong here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hello. First off, it's a real pleasure to meet you. I remember seeing you when I was 13 on the Bill Maher Show, and you were a real inspiration for me, and I bought your book, and so I'm really excited to be able to ask you this question.
Thank you.
As a young person, there are a lot of uncertainties in the immediate future. I think a lot of people would agree with me in that statement. And so in looking forward to a future that's based around truth and understanding truth, what are some immediate steps you think that young people can take to help make that a reality? And yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question and your kind words. I mean, one, I think that there has to be various networks among friends of young people who are continually wrestling with these issues and who constitute a kind of countervailing force, if not a countercultural, a kind of counter-hegemony against the narrow mainstream, the narrow conventional ways of talking, conventional ways of viewing and perceiving. Because you can't do it all alone. I do believe solitude has its place. There's no doubt about that. Be able to critically reflect for yourself, but you also have to be dialogical. You have to be polyphonic, like a jazz quartet, where you raise your voice over against other voices by learning how to listen, cultivating the faculty of receptivity as well as the giving of one's perspective. And in those small networks, the energy began to bubble over. Because we're talking about stages, social momentum, social motion, and maybe then social movements that really bring power and pressure to bear on status quos that oftentimes are reinforcing the sleepwalking.
Thank you so
Definitely.
much.
But no, it's a blessing to talk to you.
Thank you, Dr. West, for speaking truth to power and for being with us September 26, 2005 on the White House sidewalk protesting the Iraq War. Really appreciate it.
Good to see you again. Good to see you again, no problem.
Also, you should note this, you probably know this, but just in case you don't know this, besides the drone research that the Johns Hopkins University is doing, they're also the #1 military contractor amongst colleges and universities in this country. Close to $1 billion in military research, weapons research.
$1 billion.
Close to $1 billion.
Wow. Wow.
I used to listen to you and Tavis on the radio, our local radio station, WYPR, but you vanished.
Yeah, at the end of December, we decided not to keep it going, though. But we're still doing our thing. And
But
different content.
can I see the two of you talking about poverty and all the other important issues on PBS? Did I hear?
No, that show is over now.
It's over.
Yeah, it is over. It is over, though. It ended December.
I'm very sorry to hear that.
Definitely. Well, we held on for about 3.5 years
Right.
with a lot of assaults and attacks and things. No, absolutely. Absolutely. But that's all. We still speaking our truth in our respective ways. But I appreciate your support.
No problem at all.
It might be retrospective, but that's fine. That's beautiful.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming today, Dr. West.
Thank you so much.
I also watched Real Time with Bill Maher, and I think you're the best guest that he's ever had. In any show you go on, you light up the spotlight. I was just wondering if you could comment on what media outlets out there are the best to actually get truth in this country.
Oh, that's a good question. My God, my God. Me and Zaytoon talk about this all the time. I mean, I mentioned Sister Amy. I have tremendous respect for Amy Goodman. I really do. I really do. I used to watch Tom Hartman on Mine, but it looked like he disappeared, so I don't know exactly what happened there. I try to keep track of right-wing propaganda every once in a while on Fox News. You know. And the neoliberal propaganda of MSNBC, you got to keep track of because they're connected directly to the White House. And so you get a sense of what's going on in terms of the connections between the MSNBC folk and the White House folk. You know, they had the gatherings all the time that Brother Sharpton and our dear Sister Melissa and others, they're brilliant. They do wonderful things in their own way. It's just that I'm very, very critical of them not being critical enough of a White House, no matter what color the president is, and therefore you don't get that self-criticism. You just get the obsession with Fox, and Fox obsessed with MSNBC, and both of them make big, big money. You see? So you want to keep track of Sarah Palin, all you got to do is watch MSNBC. You say, look, I don't need to hear Sarah Palin. Life's too short. What? But they're parasitic on each other in that sense. So that Amy Goodman I listen to. If I'm in the radio, I like to listen to Brother Joe Madison to see what's going on the urban front. I have great respect, and Brother Joe goes back to NAACP way back. I don't always agree with my brother, but I love and respect. And when I'm a Christian, I try to love everybody. So that I got to love even for the Fox folk in terms of their humanity, not their deeds. And I got to love MSNBC, even though I'm not in love with neoliberalism. So, but the thing is that I try to read Black Agenda Report, which is very important. I read Counterpunch, very important. I read Common Dreams, very important. I try to read Your Black World if I can. There's a few folk that Boyce Watkins is fascinating. So those are some of the outlets that I try to keep track of. But for the most part, I'm just reading and on the move. Reading and on the move. Every once in a while I get a little sleep. Yeah.
Thank you.
You stay strong though.
Hi, Dr. West. My name is John, and I go to the School for Advanced International Studies down in D.C., like my colleague.
Wonderful.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for coming down and taking us all to church tonight.
I appreciate that.
As a Southerner, I really appreciate it. It feels like home. So my question is, beginning around 2009 or so, the U.S. kind of formally made LGBT rights part of its foreign policy, specifically with Clinton's speech in Geneva. Our president evolved on the issue domestically. So my question to you is, with the string of recent, I guess we could say, defeats or setbacks in Nigeria, Uganda, Russia, India, I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yes.
How are we best equipped to tackle this problem? And I recognize that domestically the situation remains atrocious, but since this is a Foreign Affairs Symposium, I'll pose it in foreign policy terms. How do we do that when we run the risk of A, it being seen as imposing Western values, and B, when we may lack the moral high ground at times because of the domestic situation, yet we see that it becomes an issue of life or death in countries like Uganda, most specifically?
No, I appreciate that question. But no, for me, the precious humanity of gay brothers, lesbian sisters, bisexual brothers and sisters, transgender folk, has exactly the same status as any other group of humanity, any other group. And in that sense, I'm a moral absolutist. You see, when it comes to black people, brown people, red people, working people, when it comes to defending the rights and liberties of the well-to-do and rich, you know, I know Michael Bloomberg has an intimate relation with this place. I defend the brother's right to express himself. And of course, he and I in solidarity on this issue of gay lesbian thing, and I'm not used to being in solidarity with that brother. On stop and frisk, as you know, we went to jail because under his administration, 4.4 million young black and brown poor would stop and frisk. So that for me, it's something that is so integral to one's conception of what it is to be human that I'm not willing to make any kind of a pullback at all. So when I see what Uganda's doing, that is autocratic, it's authoritarian, it's anti-human, it needs to be radically called into question. And we got to make sure that our precious brothers and sisters in Uganda understand that this particular slice of humanity ought to be treated the way other slices of humanity ought to be treated. Just like the vicious treatment of our Jewish brothers and sisters in Russia, or you know, West Bank, the vicious Israeli occupation. It's a moral issue. It's a moral issue for me, and for me as a Christian, it's a spiritual issue. You see what I mean? So that, and the idea that somehow the West has a monopoly on being on the cutting edge of human rights, coming from my tradition. You know, it's trying to bring in genius like Richard Pryor to break this thing down for us. The incongruity is so overwhelming. We don't return to the West to understand what it is on liberty. John Stuart Mill's a giant. Look at the footnote in relation to India. Ambedkar understood it. Let's read Ambedkar too. See what I mean? So I don't think the West should ever be viewed as having some monopoly on human values, and therefore when you hear the non-Western nations say, this is a Western thing, usually that's just a set of elites trying to avoid and deny what's really going on in that midst, which is a violation of rights and liberties. So I'm very critical of that kind of language, absolutely. Stay strong, though, man.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. And one more question, you are very kind.
Hello, Dr. West.
How you doing, my dear brother?
Good. My name is Dominic Thomas. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Northeast Baltimore. Went to Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School.
Oh, Paul Lawrence Dunbar, yes.
And now attending Hopkins. As I look around, I see a lot of people, but at the same time, I'm wondering how many people aren't here that should have heard your message and actually understood it. And I'm just, it's disheartening for me to go out into my community, to see people, to know what they're faced with day to day, because I'm faced with the same things, and them not be able to realize what's over them. How do we approach that situation? How do we change the minds of people, and how do we start that movement?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. That's a heartfelt question, and it looked like that's the last one, and we're going out on a high note in terms of your the power of your query, though, brother, because none of us have the full answer to your question. For me, because I proceed on the notion that I am who I am because somebody loved me, and the question becomes, we need to let folk know, East Baltimore, whatever, that they are loved and they're cared for. And that there's people in whatever places we find ourselves who will speak truths in relation to their suffering and will never reduce them solely to victims, even as they are victimized, that they can be agents who resist victimization. Maybe not at the moment, maybe they beat down, maybe they misguided, whatever it is. But we never give up on them, though you're never able to impact as many as you like or be impacted by, because one still has much to learn from folk in East Baltimore and so forth. They know things we know not of. And I know that's certainly true for me, because you see, I grew up on the chocolate side of town, and we may have been broke as the Ten Commandments financially, but we were spiritually rich. That's why we had a neighborhood, not a hood. You see? That when Donny Hathaway sang about the ghetto, he was singing about something positive. It was ghetto fabulous. It's true. There were voices coming out of that ghetto. There was courage coming out of that ghetto. There were movements coming out of that ghetto. So when you say ghetto, it wasn't a put down. Whereas we got a major shift in the last 40 years. Because the hood is what? Survival of the slickest. Got guns, bullets flowing, drugs on the corners that come from outside, decrepit schools, indecent housing, and so forth. So people get beat down. And you say, even as you think you are beat down, you can bounce back. and that you are loved, we care for you, we're willing to tell the truth for you, sacrifice for you, live for you, die for you. Why? Because that's what folk did for me. And I try to pass that on. And once that becomes more contagious, and once they themselves even begin to reach that conclusion more and more, then it's a new day. But the history of black people in America is precisely this cycle. 244 years of white supremacist slavery is more than a nightmare. It's indescribable. 12 years a slave only touches the ice, the tip of an iceberg of what we were dealing with. And yet, here come love warriors like Coltrane and James Baldwin and Martin King and Toni Morrison. What is it about these people that they keep dishing out these love warriors, given these structural and institutional forms of hatred and exploitation? Well, here we are now, 2014, neoliberal capitalist America, America hegemon and empire, and those on the underside have been rendered invisible for 30 years with a class war from above that pushed them to the margins. How are we going to bounce back? Well, you just watch us. Just watch us. And if we don't bounce back, then we didn't bounce back. That's it. Like I tell the young folk all the time. I say, you all are lucky that you're living now because some of y'all are multimillionaires and you can't even sing in tune. What does Aretha think? Why is it that you don't have groups like the Whispers and the Main Ingredient and Blue Magic and the Temptations and the Delphonics and the Dramatics, where they sang in harmony with different voices, listening to each other so beautifully that they touch your soul with tenderness even as you're ready to fight? Now you just got the mic with one ego out there. Even if you're a lyrical genius like Jay-Z or Kanye, just one. But what happened? Well, these are structural and institutional issues. It's not just individual issues. If you can keep the power of black people somehow so atomized and privatized and individualized and don't come together, then you never produce the dramatics. You don't know what Ron Banks and DJ Reynolds really are. You'll never produce the Temptations and have a voice like David Ruffin again, because you won't have mastery of your craft. You won't be invested enough to want to touch the souls of the people who come to your concert, because you know you only there because they are there. James Brown used to give a concert 4 hours. He would go non-stop, and he would always end the concert. Have we played a song that somebody came to hear? Oh, you missed out on Soul Power. Hit it, Bootsy. 4 hours. That's not a market mentality. That's a service mentality. I bring the funk because I'm an extension of you all, and we in this together, and I know I am empowering you in some way. This is not just entertainment. I'm a spiritual warrior trying to make sense of the world. I'm glad I got my money, but it's not just about that. That's crucial. That's